Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Tech Launchpad live stream. For those of you who are new to this and are not aware of who I am, I'm Andrew Murphy. I'm the founder of Tech Leaders Launchpad. I've been in the technology for 20 years, been leading for 15, and I had to learn a lot of stuff the hard way. I was promoted into a leadership position without any experience at leadership. I was the longest tenure engineer and given the reins of leadership and told to figure it all out myself, which is a story I hear many people say to me again and again, industry we work in. And I created Tech Leaders Launchpad so that people didn't have to do that. And this live stream is one of the ways I do that. I want to share the people I learn from, the people that make me better, the people that I want to get their message out as wide and as broad as I possibly can, because I've got something that gives this industry a benefit. We focus a lot on this industry, on the technology, which makes sense, but we should also focus on how we make our teams better, how we make the books we make better, and how we help the humans in the seats have a better, happier, and more confident in their jobs. And we're going to do today. With me, I've got Charity. Charity, do you want to say hi to the folks that are watching, and maybe kind of let them know who you are, a bit of your background for the 1% that don't know that?
Sure. My name is Charity. I am co-founder and CTO of honeycomb.io, which is can you still call it a startup when we've been around for about 8 years? I'm not quite sure. But, I've been doing that for a few years now. We were kind of the OG observability company. And before that, I worked at Parse, acquired by Facebook. I worked at Linden Lab. I've kind of identify as an operations engineer, even though I feel like the days of ops I feel like the DevOps days are kind of coming to a natural sunset, which is interesting. But operability and I guess I've gone back and forth between engineering and management several times, and I feel like I'm mostly fueled by rage and spite, but I feel like it's a fairly clean burning fuel as far as I'm concerned. I think, when we started the company, I was like, well, we're definitely going to fail. But, sounds like a fun way to spend a year or two. And 8 years later, we're still here. So,
Yeah, I think I resonate with that. The reason I started this company is because I got so angry with the industry just not learning from the mistakes that it keeps making again and again. And I spent 15 years trying to fix it from within the industry, kind of as a leader in companies, and then was like, I can't do this. I need to solve the bigger problem. I need to kind of step out and take a wider view at this, because I just got so pissed off that as an industry we're doing the same thing. So I resonate with that. Yeah. So if you're watching the live stream, I see we've got a few people already. Annalise, good morning to you as well. Thank you for posting. Martin telling us that he enjoys the whole music. Thank you. Yeah, I spent a good long few minutes choosing which of the 5 StreamYard options I was going to pick. So thank you for validating that choice. If you've got questions for Charity and I, please post them in wherever you're watching this, LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitch. We're going to be roughly discussing Charity's blog post this morning, which was my boss says we don't need any engineering managers, and the advice that Charity gave to the person that sent that email, and the blog post that came from that. But as always with these discussions, it's going to be wide-ranging and thought-provoking in many ways. So if you've got any kind of questions at all for either of us about anything to do with what we do, then please do post them in wherever you're watching this. We'll probably talk for 20-30 minutes or so, and then we'll go into the Q&As. Also got Rachel, good morning from New Zealand. Yes, it is morning here. I'm in Melbourne. This is a very cold Melbourne morning, as I was saying to Charity in our little pre-stream. My hands are like icebox this morning, so if you hear this noise, I apologize. I'll try and keep it to a minimum, but my hands are freezing. Cool. So let's kick off. Charity, did you want to tell me a little bit about that blog post, how it came about, and
Yeah.
kind of what about it sparked your energy and passion?
Yeah. So I have a friend, I guess I started out sort of like doing a little bit of coaching for him, I guess. And he was a director. He decided to become an executive. And so I was kind of meeting with him once a month as he got his first VP gigs and CTO gigs and stuff. And he took a job as VP of engineering, and his CEO, who was a former engineer, was like, one of the first things he was going to do was like, okay, we've got 30, 40 engineers and no managers. Seems like we should have a manager or two. And the CEO was like, no. And he was like, how do I deal with this? Like, it seems so obvious to me. How do you explain to someone? How do you argue for the existence of management? It's like one of those things. It's like, how do you explain why things don't float on water? You know, when it just seems like everyone should know this thing, and I was really frustrated on his behalf. But the more I started, it was just kind of one of those like brain worms where I couldn't get it out of my head, and I was like, why do we have managers? And I myself am a pretty anti-authoritarian, like anti-hierarchical person. And so I've kind of had an interesting journey towards accepting the need for management and stuff myself. Like my philosophy of leadership is really borrowed from the natural world. Like hierarchy emerges everywhere in the natural world, wherever you have self-healing, autonomous systems that can grow and make themselves more complex. And the thing about hierarchy, it's not about domination. It's not about like fascism. It's not about giving people orders. It's about organization. It's because you can't have a system where everything communicates to everything else equally. Like, it just doesn't work. And the biggest thing that I took away from systems theory is that in really complex systems, hierarchy emerges for the benefit of those on the bottom. And in hierarchical systems like this, you look down for function and up for meaning. And I just thought that was so meaningful. Like, yeah, you look down for function, you look up for meaning. And it really clarifies, like, what is the job of management? It's to orchestrate. It's to make sure I sometimes also think of managers as like the nervous system of the body. They pass messages around and make sure that the right thing gets to the right place at the right time. And this is something that, honestly, to me as an engineer, I think I always fought against, because I like to have a lot of context. I like to know everything that's going on. And I felt like all the managers had all the information, and I fucking hated that. And now I'm like, oh, I see. The system doesn't scale that way. So like the key to having, if you're like me and you don't want to be a manager, the key is to have the kind of relationship with your manager where they know what information you want and they can provide it to you, so that it's not like they're not using information as a power. They're not flexing, right? They're not gaining their power by controlling the flow of information. They're leveraging it to serve the people on their team, right? It's not like I get to know what's going on and you don't. It's like, oh, okay, this person cares about this. This person cares about this. This person cares about this. And like, I feel like, our philosophy as a company is people have a right to know what's going on in the business they work at. You can only have one job at a time. You have a right to know what's happening, right up to the level of, if it's like a privacy issue or a legal issue. There are some things that, people can't know, but up to those levels, if you want to know it, you deserve to.
I like that, the nervous system analogy there, because one thing that neurons have is they have this threshold, and a neuron can be getting a signal, and yet it doesn't pass that signal on until that signal reaches a particular threshold. And that's exactly what you're talking about in that analogy. Is the manager can be getting all of these signals from all over the places, but it's not going to pass it on to that neuron until some threshold level is reached. Whoops, I'm not sure if Charity has just frozen. This is wonderful. Let's wait a minute for her to get reconnected and come back on us. Hopefully that will happen really quickly. If you're watching this and you've got any questions, please use this as an opportunity to think about what. Oh, there we are. You're back. Charity.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. I was just using that as an opportunity to remind people to ask us questions.
Nice. The last thing I heard you say was that, managers, the neurons aren't passing on everything. They're like autonomously figuring out what's worth passing along. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I think that's something that, one of the jobs of leaders as well that they really struggle with is that idea of the functional and the meaning, and how their role changes as they progress. One of the I was coaching somebody early on in the week, and he's gone from being somebody who was, say, running one or two teams to running 20 projects. And he's really struggling with the difference between being responsible for things and being accountable for things. Yeah. And now, as he progresses in his career, he feels like his boss is telling him to do more things. That's what he's hearing. But his boss isn't saying that. His boss is saying, be accountable for more things. Yeah. And that's a really hard transition for people to go through. And it comes from this kind of difference between the functional and the meaning.
Yeah, I will often tell people that, like, your job as a manager is not to do all the things, it's to make sure that the things get done. And I think especially when you're looking at like the role of, and like if you look, like there are very few things that only engineering managers do. There's so much overlap between what EMs do and what staff engineers and principal engineers do, architecture, interviewing, recruiting, designing. Like there's because the skills really do overlap. The only things that are really intrinsically manager only tend to be like making hiring decisions, making firing decisions. When it comes to tough feedback, very senior ICs do that too. But like the job of the manager, like I sometimes think of this as like your head is down or your head is up, right? The job of the manager is to not go so deep that you're not keeping track of this stuff and making sure that everything is getting done. As an IC, you have the liberty to go deep, and hopefully you have the kind of trusting relationship with your manager where you trust them to pull you out if you need to be heads up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've got a question from Aidan here. I think you've talked about this before, but as someone who has grown a company from the ground up, do you think there are principles that come in handy during periods of significant growth? This is kind of relevant to the conversation we're just having.
Ooh, I have so many questions about what you mean by periods of significant growth, because there's the like hyper growth, which I think is mostly a function of the zero interest rate period, where it's just like, I feel like you can't responsibly grow as a company past a certain rate. Like we doubled year over year, 2 years in a row, and very intentionally did not grow faster than that, because there's only so fast you can onboard people and still do work and like sort of process the change in character as a company. We talk about like gardening your culture and grow, like having these regular conversations about what do we keep and what is it time to shed, right? What is intrinsic to us and what was a function of the stage that we were at? So like, that's one principle that I think translates really well. When you're in periods of significant growth, you might need to have that conversation every 6 months. In periods of normal growth, you might need to have that sort of conversation every year or two, right? But cultures change. And I feel like one of the most important things is I hate meta. I hate that like the more meaningful and like and like important something is, the more trite and banal it seems to sound. But like self-awareness, like just being honest with yourselves about who you are as a company and not trying to be everything to everyone, like that's always important. But when you're growing and changing, it's really important, because I used to be really cynical about company values. It just like automatic, just like eye roll, just like, oh yeah, do you strive for excellence? Do you value trust? Just like, come on, guys. And I've actually come kind of the long way. I'm like America. I always do the right thing eventually after trying everything else. But I've kind of come around to the idea that values are actually a really important part of the tool chest, because that's how you make the implicit things you value about your company explicit. And if you're doing it well, you aren't just writing down the things that are just, everybody cares about being honest and having ethics, right? But you're codifying the things that are different. The things that are most powerful to write down are the things where there's no right answer or wrong answer, but there is a answer. And having consistency and knowing what your values are and sticking to them is what makes it so that people know whether they want to work there or not, and whether it's time for them to go or not, and whether they feel like they can wholeheartedly like give their heart and soul to this effort, or whether it's just not a great fit, and I feel like we have so many mental models that are left over from like the industrial age. And I think it really befits us to realize that these are creative professions that we're in, and you can't just brute force your career. You will do a better job if you really care and if you're really bought in. And that means being explicit about values. So, periods of significant growth, obviously, there's the old canard about, you can never design any architecture for, more than an order of magnitude, your current size. I think the same thing. There are very similar cultural things, right? And there's this tendency when things are moving fast for cultural conversations to be the nice to haves. And when it feels like you don't have time to have cultural conversations, that's when you need to have them the most.
Yeah, it's like it's a culture equivalent of tech debt. It's culture debt. Yes, you can move quickly and you can make those concessions sometimes, but if you don't kind of get a handle on it, it's going to spiral pretty quickly. I think this is also useful to think about in the terms of investors. Yeah, it does. It does. I think, one thing with investors that became really, really clear to me when I worked in a scale up for a year or so is the incentives and the desires of the investors are completely often not aligned with what you want as a company. You want a sustainable business for you that gives you the growth that you need to stay sane and to stay profitable and to really kind of work. Whereas investors want you to put the foot to the floor because they want the 1 in 100 that gives them a 10,000x return, and they don't care about the 99 that fall flat on the face. Whereas you, as one of the founders, you want to be the company that stays sustainable. And this is really important with the growth and the conversations you were just talking about, Charity, of like the investors don't care about all that stuff. They just want growth. They want you to spend their money. Whereas, you as a founder, you kind of want to take a bit more of a sustainable growth approach.
It's very true. It was one of the most shocking things to me. Like, and we have really good investors. Like, they've been real true partners to us, and they're very reasonable. But like, they don't give a shit about company culture. Like, they're impatient with it. It's like it matters insofar as it shouldn't be so bad that you can't hire people. But like, they really don't see it as something to dwell on at all. And yeah, I mean, that's the weird thing about being on a board is just you've got, and this, by the way, is why we put an employee on our board. I think we're the only company in North America to ever do that, which is kind of weird because in Europe it's very common. But like when the only person who sits between the investors and their interests and the company and employees and their interests, when the only person is the CEO, that is a brutal place to sit, right? And I feel like you want to have multiple fibers that cross those things so that you understand each other a little bit better. And so like ideally you're all on the same side, you're all rowing in the same direction. But it's also very true that if you've taken VC money, you have signed up for a set of things. You have signed up for a timeline, you have signed up for a treadmill, you have signed up for things, and the people seem to just be like, oh, raising money is great, there are no downsides. There are downsides. And again, I think it comes back to being just honest and like self-reflective. Like there are some people who think that they want to work at startups who do not want to work at startups. And finding that out in the interview process is really kind of important.
Yeah, definitely. All right, let's come back to your blog post. One of the things you mentioned there is the difference between the manager's calendar and the maker's calendar, and how there's a lot of really important tasks that managers have to do, and there's often incompatibilities with how you juggle both of those types of things. Can you just talk about that for a few minutes and tell us why that's important to protect that time and to think about it differently?
Yeah, look, you can't be successful as an engineer without giving yourself time to go heads down, time to focus, time to learn things, time to sort of ingest and process a lot of information about your users, about your technologies, about your languages, about the requirements. Like it is necessary. And as a manager, your day is broken up into a bunch of stuff, right? And now there are some people who are like, well, you don't want your engineers to do any of the interviews or any of these other things because you want them heads down writing code all the time. I don't actually think that's how you get the best, most productive people. I think, especially as people get more senior, it does make sense to, like, you want your engineers to be involved in culture and you want them to have a say in the hiring pipeline and everything. But those trade-offs are real, right? And there's a tendency to drift. And I feel like managers, one of their sort of jobs is being the person whose job it is to have the head up, right? It's to be paying attention to, do people have what they need to do their jobs? And one of the absolutely critical things that people need is just enough contiguous hours to do their work. And like, this is such a balancing act. People have different interests, things that will keep them interested in their jobs. They become senior and staff and principal. So it's like, there are no like commandments or right or wrong answers. Well, there are no right answers, but that doesn't mean that there are no wrong answers. There are plenty of wrong answers. So I think that, you just want to have, and this is, by the way, this is why I feel so strongly that engineering managers should have a strong technical background. And I know that there are some amazing engineering managers out there who don't have a technical background, and they are exceptional, and I acknowledge that they exist. But in general, you want your manager to be able to accurately evaluate your work and stand up for you behind closed doors and make a pitch for you to be promoted and have your back when other people are like, well, they didn't do anything. All they did was code reviews and interviews, because ultimately as a manager, your job is not to pick individual people, is to compose a team. It's to compose a team and make sure that the team, because the smallest unit of software ownership is not an individual, it's a team, right? If you have one person who owns a product, that's a huge risk. It's not good for anyone. I mean, okay, if you're like a 5-person startup, it's inevitable and that's fine and everything. But like in general, once you're a grown-up company, huge risk. Only teams can do that. And that's why I feel like, I just wrote this big long paper about how generative AI is not going to fix or not going to, build your engineering teams for you. Really great high functioning teams tend to have a wide range of levels. They have junior folks, they have intermediate folks, they have senior folks, they have staff engineers. It's like building a bridge, right? You need people who are at the beginning of their career, people who are towards the end of their career and they're not as energetic anymore, but they have scar tissue of like bridges past that have fallen apart. You need, construction, you need different specialties. And this is where I feel like, teams that are very homogenous early on can move super fast and they can absolutely outperform diverse teams in the short term. But when it comes to building for the medium term, not even the long term, but just the medium term, having diverse teams is a superpower, right? And I don't just mean like having, men and women and different races. I mean, those things matter too. But like when you're composing a team, ask yourself, what angles of diversity do they bring? Having parents is pretty nice. They have, different, ways of approaching things and different discipline and everything. Having people who are, in their 50s can be incredible. There can be such amazing mentors. Having people who are, God, some of the most productive engineers I've ever worked with have been intermediate engineers because they aren't yet in a position where they're getting pulled into meetings and like reviews and all this stuff. They can just put their headphones on in the morning, go heads down and just crank out code. And they're so phenomenally productive, right? But that's a window of time that only lasts for like maybe 5 or 6 years. Then they've grown up and they're doing the mentoring. So you really do need to like fill this pipeline, hire junior folks. AI is great. It helps make people a lot more productive. It helps you learn faster. It helps a lot of things, but it doesn't build a team. So we've kind of wandered afield from your original question, but like I feel like the core job of a manager is to craft and curate and fine-tune teams and feedback loops.
Yeah, and you mentioned productivity in there, and I think it's worth kind of nailing that point. I see one of the jobs of EMs as to take the outputs for the teams and curate those into outcomes. You can have a team that produces a lot of lines of code, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're building the right thing.
Yeah.
And, I see one of the jobs of managers to make sure that that's what they actually do. It's not just about, it's important to write lots of code, but if that code doesn't do the right thing, then you've basically just wasted an entire sprint or quarter or whatever. And that's a really important role.
Hugely agree. Yeah, often this is done by managers. Sometimes it's done by principal engineers, sometimes by product people. Usually it takes more than one person caring about this, but I feel like it's a really crucial aspect of maturing as an engineer, is going from, oh, tech is interesting and fun and hard and I'm learning things, to being like, okay, what are we using this technology for and why does it matter?
I think that's a good segue to a question from Ivan. So Ivan said the blog post was about what will happen if we hire EMs. Ivan suggests a thought experiment of doing the reverse, which is to take a medium-sized company and then remove all the EMs from that structure. What do we think would happen if we did that? What would be the knock-on consequences?
Oh gosh, that's such a fun thought experiment. I mean, it depends is the only answer. It depends on how good the engineering managers were. It depends on what what hats they actually played. But I feel like honestly, in the short term, not much would change. And people would be like, oh, did we really need them or not? Because most of the work that managers do isn't the day-to-day stuff. It's week to week, month to month, year to year. It's making sure that we're hiring and training and recruiting and retaining, and that people are getting the support that they need, and that projects are on the right track, and that the right question, if back to your analogy about the nervous system, right? If the nervous system is kind of like dampened in the short term, your foot's still there, right? But slowly over time, it stops functioning as well, right?
Yeah, I think you would definitely start to see projects being worked on that were not necessarily the right outcomes for the company. That would start to drift off. I think you would, like you're saying, if you had PMs and staff engineers, they would do a great job of pulling that back, but they wouldn't be supported by the EMs. I think you would likely see probably really great retention in the short term, but then probably terrible retention after a few months, because those kind of crucial conversations around career development, where people want to go, advocating for those people with higher up management, advocating for getting these people the visibility that they might not otherwise have. Like a lot of really amazing engineers are not the people that have the skills to kind of advocate for themselves and make themselves be seen and heard with higher up leadership. And that's one of the roles of EM. So you would probably get a massive amount of retention in the beginning as people go, oh my God, we can work on whatever we want and do whatever we want, and then realize that actually means that these crucial conversations are not happening.
Well, there's this great essay called The Tyranny of Structureless or something like that. And it talks about how when you don't have a formal hierarchy, it doesn't mean that hierarchy doesn't exist. It just means that nobody is entirely sure who has it or who's in charge. And so you get these informal power structures all over the place, but you don't know how to navigate it, right? Unless you're one of the in crowd or unless you have the loudest voice, or, there will be decisions will get made, but in a way that has no accountability and no real mechanism for correction.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of what Aaron is pointing to in his comment here. Doesn't that just cause the role to be informal? Someone seems to often step into the leader-like role and becomes de facto EM with that title. Yeah, that would definitely start to happen. But I think this is where emergent properties versus designed properties arguments come in, and there are a lot of benefits to emergent systems, but there's a reason why we design systems, and it's because there are downsides with emergent systems as well. And often the people that step up, don't have some of the support that a design system would have.
Yeah, anytime we're talking, there's nothing magical about management titles, right? There's nothing that's like, well, this is going to save our business. It's a tool. It's a tool that has been, tested a lot and tried. There are a lot of best practices. You can read, you can learn, you can teach and everything. It's so like, choose boring technology. I always choose boring cultural tools too, right? There's no reason to reinvent the management if you don't have to. But there's nothing magical about it, which means that there are plenty of anecdotes out there about companies that are run without any management or directors or structure, and people just like know what they're supposed to do, and people just choose their own work, and it works fine. Maybe it could work better but like people, and some people have had amazing experience. You know how many really senior engineers I know who say that the best managers they ever had were the ones that were not technical at all, because they never contradicted them. They just relied on them implicitly to say what was true and what was false. And the engineers like, this is dope. I love this. I love not being questioned. And it's like, well, that might work fine. It feels to me like it might work better if someone did question you once in a while, or someone was equipped to evaluate whether or not what you were saying was true or not. But like, people love it. So, nothing magical about it. It's just a tool.
Yeah. And it's really hard to run the A/B tests on this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what would have been that person's experience if they had have had somebody who was kind of pushing them and trying to encourage them to do better. It's really hard to know
like
that.
The essential thing about management structure, I think, is that it should have a means for correction, right? Holding people responsible and accountable means that when they're doing a bad job, or when they're bullying people, or when they're really, terrible, then there should be a function that is understood for giving feedback and getting that person out. Much like democracy, right? One of the reasons we have elections is so that we can get people out. And so I feel like, if everything's great and everyone's on top of their game, maybe you don't need management. But as soon as something goes wrong, do you have a mechanism for taking care of it?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really can destroy morale in a team is somebody is obviously not performing and nobody does something about it. That is one of the quickest ways to just destroy morale in that team.
Totally.
Yeah. And another thing you kind of mentioned in the blog post was, which we kind of mentioned a couple of times in this discussion, is this idea of choosing boring culture. Like, can you give me an example of what boring culture is, and an example of what not boring culture is, and kind of why you would prefer one over the other?
Yeah, like I said, this is very much a riff off of Dan McKinley's famous post about choosing boring technology. Boring isn't bad. It just means that the failure conditions are well understood, and that you can find people who understand, the pros and the cons of the technology or the tool or the framework. I feel like a lot of tech companies work really hard to make sure that their work is fun, like the foosball and like beer pong and all this stuff. And in my experience, what people really want is a healthy company, one where people are listened to, one where underperformers or assholes are dealt with, ones where effort and good work is recognized, ones where, what you need to do is clear and things aren't just getting canceled, where good decisions are made, where, that's what people want. We don't need to make work fun, because people are fun. When people are in a healthy environment, people bring the fun, right? People are the ones who bring the in jokes and the little, like the running jokes and the character and the things that we remember so fondly, from our jobs. Like, forced corporate fun is rarely that fun. I feel like having a healthy culture where, where your values are clear and where people feel like they're seen and heard and recognized, and the work that they are doing is meaningful. I mean, the Dan Pink's book about what do we all value in our work? It's autonomy, mastery, and meaning. And if you're regularly getting those things from your work, then like you bring your fun self, right? And the fun that I always look back and remember is the fun that my coworkers brought. Just, the gallows humor, being on call in the middle of the night when you're all up at 2 a.m., you're just cracking jokes about the database. Or like, I remember when we were running Ruby on Rails, and we had these unicorn workers. We did this rewrite and got rid of them. And I brought lighter fluid and these paper rainbows down to the Facebook quad and we set them on fire. We're like, fuck the rainbows, they're gone, as we were spitting down the last ones. It's like, that's not corporate fun, right? That comes from the people. So I feel like the thing about management is it's boring. It's very boring, that you have, I used to be very anti-levels for engineers too. I found it really demotivating and gross. Like, I don't want to think about what level I am, but I've come to realize, sort of regret, like almost begrudgingly, that in the absence of actual structure, the tyranny of structureless is not actually fun. Having some structure that isn't perfect, but it exists, so you can give feedback on it, you can tweak it, you can modify it for your needs. Using the same sort of structure as the rest of the industry is also really powerful, because the more consistency there is, the more the more you can take for granted. Innovation tokens is the other part of that blog post, right? Choose boring technology. You have a few innovation tokens and you should spend them on things that are critical differentiators for your business, right? So it's not saying never be creative, but creativity has a cost, right? It has a high cognitive carrying cost whenever you're trying to do something genuinely new. So like holacracy and some of these sort of like, anarchic, ways that people have invented to try and run companies, they're very costly, they're very expensive, and you end up devoting a lot of your creativity and brain space to trying to figure out these new and creative ways of running your company, instead of devoting that to your product and your differentiators and things will actually help you succeed as a business.
As you've been talking, my mind has been going to the huge parallels, and I know you're really keen on the phrase socio-technical and this interaction between those two things, and the huge parallels between what you're talking about there and the technology frameworks we use to build our software has just been ringing a massive bell in my head. Nobody builds their own React. You would think if you joined a company and that company had built their own SPA framework or their own ORM or whatever, you would think, yeah, that's a smell. And there are cases, there are times when that is the right thing to do, but more often than not, when somebody does it, it's not the right thing to do. And so I think there's probably analogies there to these social systems of ways of working, and the way that we structure our teams, where sure, let's just choose the thing that we know works, and do we really think we're special enough to warrant that additional overhead of building our own thing? Probably not.
100%. Martin made this comment about different personalities need different amounts of structure. I read this great book called The Four Tendencies, and it's about motivation. So there's internal motivation, like what motivates you, and then there's external motivation, right? And then there's like four possible combinations. There are the type of people who are like upholders, who are super motivated by their own checklists and anything that anyone else asks them to do. Great. And then there are people who are only motivated, like if they want to do something, they're unstoppable, but they're not really motivated by things that other people want them to do. Then there's the reverse. There's people who need a gym buddy, right? They respond really well to external structure and have a hard time sticking to the things that they personally want to do. And then there's the type, which is sadly my type, that just like rejects both motivators, and just like as soon as I'm supposed to do something, it's the last thing I want to do, and it just kind of like it's a constant struggle to get around that. But like it's so true, and I think that's really important when you're an engineering manager, is knowing your people and knowing who needs what. This isn't actually a question of seniority versus not seniority. It's about what do they need from you. Some people need and crave external structure. Some people, that's the worst thing you can do to them.
Yeah, Martin followed up with this comment: lack of structure can be scary to some folks. Yeah, 100%. Especially if you're new in your career and you don't know what to expect. Uncertainty in general can be scary for a lot of people. And if you're really new in your career and just starting off, there's so much uncertainty already. Do we want to add whole heaps of new uncertainty to their plate? Like let's just keep that uncertainty to a minimum as much as we can. I'm going to put your own comment up, charity so you can talk about it? What's this?
Oh, that's the thing I was just like rattling off about how there's, people who like really respond well to external structure or internal structure or both or one or the other or neither. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've never seen that. I definitely need to have a look at that. Thank you for that. That's good. That's going to go onto my list. We've got a comment from Aaron. I know you're joking, Aaron. I think it's worth kind of pointing out the difference. Like, yeah, Facebook made their own React. Like, are you Facebook? No. If you are Facebook, sure, build your own React. But if you're not Facebook, chances are that's the bad decision to do. And that's that's really the point that I think you're making, Charity, is like there are times to do this. If you're not Facebook, you probably shouldn't.
We wrote our own storage engine. We tried everything else first, and then we wrote our own storage engine. But it's a huge differentiator for us. But it takes a lot of resources, right? So.
Yeah, and that differentiator point, I think that's the thing that is really important there. If it's core to making you a successful competitor in the market or making you able to disrupt what's going on from a technical point of view, then it's worth considering. I think rarely it can happen, especially in a very competitive market, in a candidates market. I think rarely those same decisions would apply to like a cultural decision. I think rarely the culture of a company is going to be a unique selling point. I can see arguments. I know Valve, for example, the creator of Steam and the other things like that. They have a very unique corporate structure, and that is, they say, their differentiator in the market, and that's one of the reasons that they're successful. Brilliant, glad it worked for them. That it's probably a fluke, not a rule, is why that's worked for them.
The bigger you get as a company, the more kind of generic your culture needs to be, because you need to be able to appeal to a wide range of people. In the early days of Honeycomb, Christine and I will sometimes joke that the only things we had going for us was we handled high cardinality and we had 2 women founders. And like, this would make me a little cranky. Some people would be like, why? I'd be like, why do you want to come work at Honeycomb? They'd be like, well, I'm sick of working for, a bunch of, white dudes. And I'd be like, is there anything else you like about us? Like, it's kind of like being told that someone wants to date you because you're a woman, it's just like not great. But like, I won't deny that it worked to our advantage. There are a lot of people who are really out of our league who came to work with us just for that reason. And it's what allowed us to grow up, right? We attracted, we hit above our weight average, or whatever that sports metaphor is, for a long time. And we really benefited from just how many people were interested in coming and working in a slightly different way. We talked a lot about our culture from very early on, which I think, was probably about as much as having 2 women founders, but, it definitely helped us stand out. And there were years there when it was so competitive to hire engineers, and we never had any trouble, just because so many people were like, it resonates with me. I would like to try that slightly different, twist on culture that you've gotten. But I would say that we were all of the cultural stuff that we really tried to do was about health, not being exciting,
Yeah, and you've got to use the advantages you've got as a startup and a scale. You've got to be able to. Yeah, like if you don't, you're not going to be successful. We're getting close to the top of the hour, so if you've got any more questions, folks at home, please make sure you post them in the next couple of minutes, because we're going to be getting to the end of this pretty quickly. Just as my kind of last structured question, we've talked about like the benefits of engineering managers. We talked about the benefits of structure. As with all good things, there is so much there is such a thing as too much of a good thing.
Hell yeah!
And what are some of the danger signs that you're approaching this kind of too much overhead, too much structure, too much management, and what are the downsides of that, and what are the fixes to that?
It's very important to remember that management is overhead. It absolutely is overhead. And it is, that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, but it does mean you should have as little as possible while covering the bases that you want to cover, right? So like if you're a young, scrappy company and you've got a ratio of like 1 engineering manager to every 4 or 5 engineers, why? Because the thing about overhead is it does have this tendency to it's like a gas. It expands to absorb all available resources and then some. Like nobody's ever going to feel like they have time, right? Like nobody's going to feel like they have spare time. Everyone is always very busy, and that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that they're doing has to be done, right? Like you can get into communication for the sake of communication. You can get into over engineering your or prematurely optimizing your job ladders or your whatever, as little as keeping it lean and efficient, and kind of constantly asking yourself, do we still need this? Is this still valuable? I think a really good sign of too much overhead is just meeting creep, when there are just a lot of meetings and it seems like way too many for the stage of the business that you're at. It's just like, why? I will say that when you're a fully distributed company, there is more of this kind of overhead to be done, because so much of being distributed and being successful at it means making implicit things explicit. The things that you would all just sort of naturally do when you're all in the same room, huddled around a whiteboard, takes planning, takes, predictability, takes, more effort when you're distributed. So you kind of have to grow up a little bit earlier, I think, structurally. But what's the golden ratio of managers to engineers? I think around 7 or 8. Because part of that is because I heard a rule of thumb at Facebook that is always kind of stuck in my mind, which is every direct report takes up about a half a day a week, which is pretty true in my experience. It's also a really good size for on-call rotations. If you've got 7 or 8 people, you can staff a full on-call rotation, and everyone's on call for a week every 2 months. That's really healthy. So I think that when you've got like 1 to 10, somebody's not getting the attention that they need, most likely. But then again, it varies. When you've got a small company where everybody knows everybody else, then you can. When we were small, and Emily was the only engineering manager we had for a very long time. So it varies. But I do think that when you get into like 1 to 4, 1 to 5, it's like, what's going on here?
Yeah, definitely. And I think Ara makes a point of, if you've got basically a manager that only has 1 direct report, unless you're like, again, scrappy startup, there's potentially some kind of issue going on there.
God.
Like, especially if that direct report has direct reports. Like, if you've got, say, a director, and reporting into the director is a group manager, and nobody else, and then reporting into that group manager is all the EMs, there's probably something
I've heard this referred to as a string of pearls, when you've got 1 person reporting to 1 person, reporting to 1 person, reporting to 1 person. And yeah, it's such a sign of something's fucked up. You might be using management as a promotion to retain people, even when you don't need more managers. You might be, they might not be doing any management work, but just calling themselves managers. As soon as someone becomes a manager, there's like a fixed amount of overhead. It doesn't matter if they have 1 report or 10, that like they're only going to, it's like a third of your time, I feel like, because you're going to all these meetings, you're in all these channels, you have to participate in these conversations. So like that's a serious drain on your productivity. And so the person who's a manager with a very small team of 1 to 3 people is either not really doing much management work at all and not really doing a great job for their team, or they're spending all their time in management stuff, and it's just incredibly wasteful.
Yeah, I think in that example with the string of pearls, I've not heard it called that yet. That's a great phrase. If you've got, say, a manager and their DR who basically all attends the same meetings, and there's no distinct meetings between the two, that's definitely an indication of like, why are you doing that? There's very little benefit. I have seen some, as with all of these things, there are exceptions, and I think one of the exceptions to this could be when one of them is hugely focused upwards at the business and the senior leadership team, and the other one is hugely focused downwards and operationally on the team. I've seen that work well, especially when, say, the person at the top is one of the founders and is like, yeah, I'm here because I'm a founder. I'm not necessarily here because I want to operationally run the team.
Yeah.
But like, again, that's the exception, not the norm.
Yeah. And there's also something we said for like
cool
temporariness. Okay. I mean, we get into all these suboptimal structures temporarily. As long as everybody knows this kind of sucks, but it's going to be this way for, you know, a few months until we get more people or whatever. I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, definitely. All right, we are at the top of the hour. We are at the end of this good discussion. As with all of this, I am shocked with how quickly the hour disappears underneath us. Thank you, everybody, for asking your questions, making your comments. You are who make this a fun and engaging thing for us as speakers and also the rest of the audience. Thank you, Charity, for sharing your wisdom and continuing to write blog posts and then coming to talk to me about them. I think it's a hugely valuable thing that you do for the industry.
Thank you.
Just very quickly before we end, my next live stream is going to be in about a month's time. I'm catching up with a good friend of mine who I used to work with at Linktree, Phil Johnson, where we both had experiences in our lives of working for both agencies and product companies, and kind of the upsides and downsides of both of those, and how, you know, there are good things about working in an agency and there are bad things about working in a product company, and it's not such a clear cut thing as everybody should go work at a product company. There are people who are suited to both, and we're going to kind of dissect and go through that. If you like this sort of stuff and you want to subscribe, if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to me on YouTube. If you're watching on LinkedIn, please follow me on LinkedIn. And I say this at the end of every live stream, and thousands of people have seen this, and you know, only a few people have done it. Genuinely, that first QR code in that list is to book a 20-minute chat with me to talk about anything leadership, for me to kind of give you either just an ear to listen or advice if you want it. It is not a sales pitch. I promise you, it is not a sales pitch. I do this because I want to do it and I enjoy it. Charity and I were talking about this before. Like, you know, part of the reason we do this stuff is because we enjoy doing it. We get value out of it, and we want to help the industry. Please book 20 minutes in with me to have a chat. The reason why it's 20 minutes is generally we spend half an hour on it instead of 20 minutes. And if I make it half an hour, it ends up being 45. So knowing that it's going to overrun, I set it to 20 minutes rather than 30 minutes. Charity, is there anything you want to send people about you, the stuff that you're doing?
I'm on Twitter, Mipsy Tipsy. I have my blog at charity.wtf, and I just wrote a long blog post for Stack Overflow about why generative AI is not going to build your engineering teams for you. So have a look if you'd like.
Awesome, brilliant. I will definitely give that a read. Thank you again, Charity, for coming along, and thank you everybody for watching, and see you next time on Tech Leaders Launchpad live stream. Have a good day, everybody. See you later.